All right, so I want to talk just for a minute about the book of Hebrews. Right, so there's a lot of uncertainty about who wrote the book. There is no author mentioned within the text. And so I want to kind of give a little background first and then show you some things within the text that I think will help solidify who wrote this book. And so there are two kind of main theories out there that are based on kind of a document found in antiquity that gives authorship to one says that Clement wrote it, the other one says that Paul wrote it. Right? The one that says Clement wrote it is possible. In my mind, that's not as strong of a case for that one. Clement was one of Paul's traveling companions, and honestly, I've read Clement's other work. We have some books from Clement. In fact, the book that Clement wrote is to the Corinthian church, the same church that Paul wrote his books of Corinthians to. Clement also, Clement was Paul's traveling companion. After Paul's death, Clement, still burdened for the church there in Corinth, wrote some things to Corinth, and we have those documents. And in fact, that's where we get the information that Paul did not die in Rome, but was able to continue on to Spain, just as he alluded to hoping to do in the book of Acts, right? So the book of Acts kind of ends with Paul hoping that he can go from Rome westward. And Clement's work, when he wrote back to the Corinthian church later, many years later, kind of took that for granted. It kind of says, and we all know that after Paul was released in Rome, that he went on and gave his life as a martyr in Spain. And so we kind of get information about Paul from Clement. But in reading Clement, it's kind of a little bit different style than Hebrews. And so, and Hebrews is kind of unique. You can't necessarily fit it into some of Paul's other letters either. But I do think there's some interesting things in it that lean towards Pauline authorship. So let's talk for a second about the document that we have that says Paul wrote. It comes from the librarian at Alexandria. And so Alexandria is a city in northern Egypt that at the time had a large Jewish population, that when the Babylonians came in and decimated the temple, they left many people to work the farms. They were receiving tribute from the workers. And so many people that didn't want to deal with that fled to Egypt and started colonies primarily in Alexandria. And in Alexandria, they had this massive building that was one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world, and it was the library at Alexandria. And it was this massive collection of books, and there was a large Jewish population that was heavily invested in working and maintaining records within the library there at Alexandria. And one of these guys that was heading up the library recorded that Paul had written the book of Hebrews to that Jewish population there at Alexandria, and that he had, as a form of respect, left his name out of it, but had sent it to that large Jewish group that had settled in to Alexandria, which really makes sense because that's a massive Jewish population that was seemingly unreached during the initial ministry expansion of Paul through areas of Asia and Turkey, into Greece and Asia Minor. As Paul's doing all of that, reaching Jews from the diaspora there, primarily the Assyrian diaspora from the 10 tribes, there is also then the Jewish exodus from the tribe of Judah and some of the southern regions that fled over into Alexandria. And those people are in many ways not reached at all through the stories of the book of Acts, right? So it makes sense that Paul would at least write to them a letter. And then it also makes sense why that letter has a very Jewish flavor to it, because it was written to a population of Jewish believers in Alexandria. So that is the document that we have, that the head librarian at that massive library records that as having come to them from the hand of Paul. In terms of within the text, is there anything that we can see within the text that would help us to think that it's Paul? Because he doesn't open with hi, this is Paul, right? And it's interesting that the librarian at Alexandria gave a reasoning for that. He said that Paul did that out of respect for the Jewish population. He wasn't trying to come across as prideful or anything, and so it was a literary form of respect of why Paul did not include his name. But they knew it was from him because the person who delivered the letter told them this is from Paul, right? And he wanted them to know it was from him. There's a literary respect that he did not include his name so as to not appear boastful, right? So within the text, and I think this is in many ways almost definitive. It's the most definitive thing I've come across in terms of who wrote the book of Hebrews. In Paul's writing, he says that he ends all of his books in the same way, and it was kind of his hallmark. And the closing phrase that you will find in every one of Paul's books, if you go, and you can do this, you go and look within the last paragraph or so of every known Pauline book, right, from Romans all the way through down to Philemon, every single one of them has essentially the same phrase somewhere at the end. And it says, "The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you." And Paul closes all of his books with that same phrase. Some of them it's the very last phrase, some of them it's in the last paragraph. But Paul uses that phrase as his summary in every book that he's written that we know he wrote. If you go to the other books of the Bible, it's not in there. Like nobody else closed it. That was Paul's hallmark. "The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you." Right? And so if you will go to every one, go all the way through each of his books, from Romans all the way through, you'll find that same phrase. And if you go to the end of Hebrews, in the last paragraph of Hebrews, in the same way as all of Paul's other writings, you will find he closes it in the same way. "The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you." And so we have fairly credible evidence from Alexandria that Paul wrote this. And I think we have some pretty clear internal evidence because this book is closed with the same phrase that Paul closed all his other books with.